Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 17. Today we'll discuss using sources ethically. Before we begin, you'll need the following materials for today's lecture assignment. You'll need a document for writing, and you'll need access to the internet. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. We'll define the term ethics, we'll explore the ethical implications of using outside source material, so the scholarly sources that you are collecting for Project 3 would be a great example. And then we'll also examine key considerations for using sources ethically. What are ethics? That is the first question that we are going to have to tackle. So in the most basic sense, ethics are a way for thinking about if something is right or wrong, if we are acting in the best interest of everyone by what we're doing. So there are a number of ways that we can approach ethics, and I mean, there are whole courses dedicated to it. So we are just going to get a tiny sliver um, of what ethics are and how we can apply them. Now, we are going to look at ethics through the four basic principles. And in fact, you'll probably notice this in other fields as well. So for example, if you are in, let's say, like a medical type field or a medical based field, you probably have seen these principles come up quite a few times because they come up a lot in medical philosophy. But the four that we're going to look at today, as it relates to evaluating and incorporating sources that we can use in our own writing, will be the principle for respect to autonomy, the principle of beneficence, the principle of non-maleficence, and the principle of justice. The first that we will look at will be the principle for respect to autonomy. What that basically means is live and let live. So if one's actions only affect the individual, it is unethical to dictate their behavior. It also addresses the obligation to respect others and how they go about things. So if someone doesn't use the exact same brand of toothpaste that you do, if you aren't, paying for the toothpaste, if you haven't asked to use the toothpaste, if you're just a guest in their bathroom for 30 seconds, just let the person use whatever toothpaste they want. So that is the principle for respect to autonomy. So the same thing goes for research as well. Perhaps how someone has gathered their research, perhaps for how they are deciding to approach it or the framework that they are utilizing. So if that is just how they decided to approach this topic, cool, let them do that and explore it through that lens. Don't try to enforce upon another type of way to approach the issue, at least on their work. You can certainly critique it, but just respect the thought process and the way that others have gone about it. Principle of beneficence. So really what these next two that we're going to look at, what they get at is, are you doing things for the right reason? Are you engaging in certain activities? Are you gathering data? Are you making arguments to circulate among others? Are you doing it for the right reason? When we look at the principle of beneficence, what it advocates is that action should bring about good, that you should be trying to bring about good for the public and for the people. That also means that action should be framed or started with good intention. So for learning more, to improve society, to improve the quality of life for a certain group of individuals who may have been denied that historically. So what beneficence really gets at is making sure that the research that you're looking at and the research that you yourself are doing are all coming from a good place and are meant to improve upon the lives or the situation of yourself or others or the field that you're researching or operating within. The next principle that we want to look at that goes, in my opinion, hand in hand with beneficence is the principle of non-maleficence. So that advocates doing no harm. And where harm cannot be avoided, it must be minimized. So, for example, let's say you're reading over research that that looks at blood types or blood disorders, and you want to talk about how to prevent them. Okay, so obviously non-maleficence would mean we don't want to do any harm, right? So, if I'm collecting a blood sample and I have to do a little pinprick on my finger, yeah, that's going to hurt. That's going to cause a little bit of harm. And so ethically, as researchers, what we want to do is to say, okay, well, we know that harm cannot be completely avoided. We know that in order to test out this hypothesis, we're going to have to, extract a little bit of blood. So how can we minimize that? How can we get the sample that we need perhaps in one pinprick as opposed to doing one on each finger? So that would be an example of, in terms of research, how you can minimize harm if harm cannot be avoided. And of course, you don't want to actively work to increase the harm experienced by others. Finally, we want to look at the principle of justice. Now, that advocates an obligation to provide others with what they are owed. And this really gets at treating others as equally, fairly, and impartially. When we look at these principles, of course, we can perhaps make connections to our day-to-day lives, maybe our professional lives as well, depending on, our professional trajectory there. But these principles can also very readily apply to collecting and using different source material in our own work. So let's take a closer look at that. It's important to remember, though, that as we gather and use information during the research process, or really during any process, anytime you're composing to engage with others, or to convince others, or to inform others, you want to do so ethically. I want to address, though, that we are looking at this and discussing this topic through Western conventions of ethical information gathering. So, a lot of the practices that we are really digging into inform the ways that you will see scholars, especially coming out of like Europe, North America, how they tend to approach the issue, and a lot of that, and how they approach their research, and a lot of where that comes from is just that we all tend to rely heavily on the Greeks and the Romans for our ethics regarding those issues. So just do keep that in mind, that different cultures will have different ways of approaching gathering and using sources. And I do apologize for my very shameless The Good Place reference here, but I figured I can't do a lecture on ethics and not make at least one Eleanor and Chidi reference. So, it's like, who died and left Aristotle in charge of ethics? Plato. And yes, he did. And that is why I think we view things through a more Western lens, at least in for this course, is, because Aristotle, Plato, those kind of minds really shaped how we approach composing information and sharing information. So when we think about the ethics of gathering information, so finding content either from Google Scholar, the library databases, or from the library itself, we first want to access all information legally, and that applies to the principle of beneficence, principle of non-maleficence, and principle of justice, as we want to make sure that we are starting out our research process with good intentions, and good intentions come from gathering our information through a legal sense. So we can see how beneficence and non-maleficence really ties in there, but also in terms of principle of justice. Just as you would want someone to access your information legally if you had written an article or a book, you want to extend that same behavior to other writers as well. We also want to use search terms that reflect cultural awareness and will produce a desire to improve society as a whole. So, you don't want to use any derogatory terms or terms that can be deemed offensive or provide skewed search results. And really that gets at principle of non-maleficence and principle of justice. So we don't want to do any harm to others, especially if the research we're doing involves a specific group of individuals or people. We don't want to start from the get-go as framing them poorly, because then all of the research we're going to find is just going to frame them poorly. And this also, you can see, ties into principle of justice, because we want to treat them treat research as equal and treat those it concerns as, in a fair way. We also want to seek information that is relevant and will not either intentionally or unintentionally mislead readers. This comes down a lot to principle of beneficence and principle of non-maleficence. So when we provide, or when we are looking for information to serve as evidence to support our argument for our readers, we want to make sure that the accuracy is there, that the information is correct. So that way we can continue the good through our own research, and we can avoid any bad or harm that misinformation or incomplete information might cause. Let's now look at using information ethically. So when we are actually composing our annotated bibliography and later incorporating these sources into our own argument in Project 4, how do we go about ethically including these sources, and how do we do that in a correct fashion? So first and foremost, use the information as the author intended. So that's going to be principle of respect for autonomy and principle of justice. So for example, if you find an acknowledgement to a counter argument, let's say you are writing on vaccinations, and you're reading a pro-vaccination, why vaccinations are good scholarly article, and they're acknowledging perhaps an anti-vaxxer argument, right? So if you're making an anti-vaxxer argument, and you say, oh, look, so-and-so says that. No, so-and-so really isn't making that argument. They're just responding to something else. That quote might have been taken out of context and it's being used incorrectly. So as you go through, you want to really be aware of, okay, well, what is the author trying to do with this information? And how can I ensure that that information is relayed to my readers as this author intended it to be? So you also want to use the information as support for your argument and do not allow it to function as the argument itself. And that's principle for respect for autonomy and principle of beneficence. So what I've noticed, not just with student writers, but with professional writers as well, is that oftentimes they'll find a source that works really well and speaks to their argument, but then as the essay and the argument unfolds, they tend to rely on those one or two sources to really do a lot of their explaining and a lot of their rationalizing. So they use this source to rationalize their argument to the point where they don't really have an original argument anymore. Now, this does a couple things. First, it completely reshapes what the original author intended, so it doesn't really respect their autonomy for what they initially had thought of for their piece, but also it doesn't really extend the conversation, so you can't do much good with it if you're just sort of repeating what someone else has said. So you can see how there isn't a lot of good that's coming out of it. It's just sort of a moot point, if you will. So, when you do start to incorporate sources, especially into your extended argument in Project 4, you want to make sure that your argument is the focal point throughout the entire work, and that you are using you're peppering sources in to support your argument, not to function as your argument. And then you want to provide all necessary citations both within and at the end of your text. So this is basically when you see the parenthetical citation, be that the page number or the year of publication, or regardless of whatever citation style that you're using, you will see both in text and end of text citations. Now this really gets at three of the principles. So principle for respect to autonomy, because when you include those citations in there, let's say I'm your reader, I can say, oh, this is a really interesting quote. I would like to better understand what the original author meant. Well, because you've included that in-text citation, I can more immediately locate the full citation at the end of your work, and I can go read it for myself. It's also the principle of beneficence. So you're bringing about good by giving credit to the original author. But you're also, as I kind of talked about earlier, you're also extending the conversation and showing to say, hey, this is what so-and-so said. Here's that citation for it. And here's how my work grows upon that or extends upon that. And then, of course, principle of justice. Again, just as you would want someone to cite you for your own original ideas in their work, you want to extend that to other authors as well. Let's talk about the lecture assignments. So what I want you to do is I want you to find a story that's occurred within the last 5 years that demonstrate the unethical use of information. Now, this story can concern any facet of life, though I will recommend try to find one that relates to your topic. But it must be a publicly accessible story in which information was used unethically. So think about, something coming from a mass media source or something perhaps that was, let's say, incorrect information circulated on a website or a Facebook post or something along those lines. So really, it's kind of open, but it just has to, in some way, shape, or form, demonstrate information being used unethically. Now, in your write-up, what I'd like you to do is provide a brief summary of the story, so the who, what, where, when, why. Identify the principles of ethics that were violated. So what made the gathering or use of that information unethical? So did it have to do with it was just rooted in a bad place, so it was a group who was it was someone trying to intentionally hurt, another group of individuals, or perhaps maybe the information that supported that piece, maybe it wasn't cited properly intentionally, and so that really gets at the disrespecting or violating respect for autonomy. And then I want you to identify the consequences, either real or possible. So if this unfolded and someone used information unethically and we saw a direct result, you can include that, or what you think should be, was the consequence of the unethical gathering slash use of the information. So either what did happen or what do you think ought to have happened or might have happened because that information was used unethically. So for example, if you're saying, oh, well, this public figure spoke out about this, but intentionally used incorrect information, well, maybe that person got fired the next day. That could have been a real consequence. Or maybe you're looking at a locally published story and you're like, oh, hey, this information was incorrect. The person didn't get fired, but now no one trusts this publication. So, or no one should trust this publication. So again, depending on the information available, it can either be real consequences or speculative consequences. All right, weekly homework. So be sure to include the core lecture 17 summary and assignment in your week 8 homework submission. Also, in your week 8 homework submission, you should include the summaries and assignments of core lectures 15, 16, and 17, as well as the summary and assignment from a mini lecture of your choice. This is all going to be due on Sunday, March 3rd. If you have any questions or would like to discuss these concepts further, please don't hesitate to contact me via Canvas's direct messaging system. All right, everyone, until next time.